The red fault light beside Ride 9 kept blinking against the wet metal wall, slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. I stood in the uphill service corridor with my flashlight hanging useless at my side and listened to something knock from inside the sealed door. Not pounding, not begging, just 3 careful hits, a pause, then 3 more. Far downhill, through the dark trees and the dead midway, carousel music drifted up thin and warped on the cold air. The knocking changed after that. It slowed down and spaced itself out, like it knew I was still there listening. That was when I understood opening that door would start the night moving again. I didn't know any of that when I took the job. At the start of that first night, it still sounded like easy money. My pickup had been making a dry rattling noise somewhere under the cab for the last 2 weeks, the kind that never got louder fast enough to force you to fix it, but never went away long enough to let you relax. I heard it all the way up the mountain road, mixed in with the wash of wet tires on blacktop and the loose clink of tools behind my seat. The road narrowed once I got out past the last cluster of gas stations and chain places, then narrowed again after that until it felt like the trees were leaning in over both shoulders. The pavement stayed slick from an earlier rain, and every curve looked sharper in the dark than it probably was in daylight. Old tourist signs kept appearing at the edge of the headlights and then slipping past me, half rotted and faded, promising scenic overlooks, mountain fun, family attractions, places that either didn't exist anymore or probably should have stopped trying a long time ago. That part of East Tennessee outside Johnson City always felt older after dark. Not old in the historic sense, old in the worn-out sense, like too many things had been left up too long and too many people had tried to squeeze one more season out of places that should have been allowed to die. I kept one hand loose on the wheel and tried not to think about money, which of course meant I thought about nothing else. I'd lost my last job over something stupid. Not a fist fight, not some huge blow-up, just one argument too many with the owner of a small lodge property where I'd been doing maintenance work. He wanted a handrail patched instead of replaced and a breaker issue ignored until after a busy weekend. I told him that was a good way to get somebody hurt. He told me I was getting too comfortable talking back. By the end of that week, I was done there. After that came Trevor Sykes, who I should have known better than to trust. He came at me with a smile, a fast plan, and just enough local logic to make it sound real. A used food trailer, a rented patch near a busy route, coffee, fried dough, breakfast sandwiches for tourists heading up into the mountains. He talked about leaf season and quick turnaround and how all I needed was one good run to get back on my feet. I put in money I didn't have, borrowed the rest against the truck, and watched Trevor disappear before the thing ever opened for real. By the time I understood how bad I'd been played, he was gone, his number was dead, and I was the one getting calls every day from people who wanted their money on time. So when I saw the posting for night work that paid weekly and started immediately, I didn't waste much energy asking whether it sounded right. I asked whether it was real. When the answer came back yes, that was enough. The park announced itself a little at a time. First the glow of a few lights through the trees, then a rusted service gate, then a sign up ahead on a stone base, big enough to have once mattered, with half the letters dim and the rest burning unevenly through cracked plastic. The whole property sat up on the slope like it had been left there by mistake. Parts of it were dark enough to disappear into the ridge behind it. Parts of it still had power. A few pole lights along the lower lot buzzed and hummed over wet pavement. The front office windows were lit. There was even a maintenance cart parked off to one side, which somehow made the place feel stranger than if it had been fully dead. I parked beside a line of empty spaces with old paint flaking off the asphalt and sat there for a second with the engine idling. The building ahead had the tired look of somewhere still pretending to be in business for reasons nobody wanted to explain. I killed the engine, grabbed my jacket, and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled like wet leaves, old wood, and electrical heat. Inside, the office was warmer than I expected and dimmer than it should have been. There was a desk, a wall of monitors, a stained coffee maker, and too much paper stuffed into trays and clipped to boards. A man in a work jacket stood behind the counter with a clipboard in one hand and a pen in the other. He had the heavy, sleepless look of somebody who'd been holding the same bad job together for longer than he should have. Ronnie looked at the clipboard. "You Owen Talley?" "That's me," I said. I looked past him toward the monitors. "This place still open?" Ronnie kept his eyes on the paperwork. "Parts of it." That answer should have landed like a joke. It didn't. He said it like a man giving a weather report. I noticed then that one of the screens on the back wall wasn't showing anything useful at all. It was just a wash of black and white static, steady and bright, while the others showed empty paths, gates, and dim sections of the grounds. Another monitor had been turned face down against the wall, like somebody didn't want to look at it. Ronnie slid the clipboard toward me and had me sign in. He didn't say the name of the park. He called it the property once, then the grounds. Like naming it too clearly would have made something less manageable. When he took the clipboard back, he glanced toward the hall behind the office and told me Luther Wynne was still on shift and would walk me through the route. I remember looking that way and seeing a tall man step into the light with a flashlight in one hand and a folded paper in the other. The first thing I thought was that he looked even more tired than I felt. The second was that if this place had worn him down that far, I probably should have turned around right then. Luther Wynne didn't waste time trying to make the place sound better than it was. He gave me a flashlight that felt older than I was, a ring of keys heavy enough to drag at one side of my jacket, and a radio with a cracked clip on the back. Then he stepped out of the office and I followed him into the cold like I was already late for something. Up close, the property felt less like an abandoned park and more like a place that had been reduced piece by piece and never fully admitted it. The front gate still worked, at least enough to lock. The turnstiles stood dark behind it, their chrome dulled and spotted from years of weather pushing in whenever the wind changed. Beyond that sat the lower section, where the old guest paths branched off around the midway and the family rides. A few floodlights still held on down there, throwing pale cones over wet concrete and patchy landscaping. The rest of the lights were either dead or too weak to do much more than remind you they'd once belonged to something bigger. Luther pointed downhill. "Lower path first, upper side after 1. "Why after 1? I asked. He kept walking. "That's the route." He said it the same way Ronnie had said parts of it. Flat, final. Like questions weren't useful unless they changed the job in front of you, and this one didn't. We started with the front gate, where he showed me the lock housing, the access panel, and the way the chain needed to be fed through twice, because the latch on one side had started sticking in damp weather. Then he took me past the security room again and down toward the lower midway, where the park's old life still clung hardest to the walls and windows. There were painted mascots with their colors leached out by sun and rain, smiling families in faded graphics along closed snack stands, and a whole row of dead game stalls with plastic prizes hanging inside that had gone the same color as attic dust. Some of the shelves still held plush toys and cheap balls and boxed novelty junk under a film of gray that made it all look like it had been sealed away rather than left behind. Luther moved through it with the practical rhythm of somebody walking the same route every night. Check the side locks, test the access doors, make sure the breaker shed at the lower path was still secure. Note any light that had gone out since the previous shift. Don't bother with anything already tagged dead unless Ronnie specifically wanted eyes on it. Keep the radio on. Keep moving. The lower carousel sat behind a low fence near the edge of the family section, dark and still under its rounded roof. The horses were covered in tarps that had come loose in places, so a painted ear or open mouth showed here and there in the flashlight beam. The ride looked worse covered than it would have naked, more like something waiting than something shut down. Luther didn't stop there. He only angled the beam across the gate, checked the chain, and kept going. Past that, the midway narrowed into service access and old queue lines. The rails zigzagged through empty space where people used to stand shoulder to shoulder for rides and games. Water had gathered in the cracks, leaves had piled in the turns. On either side, shuttered food windows sat under metal awnings with old menu boards still bolted above them. Funnel cake, corn dogs, lemon ice. Half the lettering was gone. The other half looked embarrassed to still be there. I looked over one dead game stall and asked, "You get many break-ins up here?" "Not enough to matter," he said. That answer stayed with me. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. Not enough to matter could mean none. It could mean one every few months. It could also mean people came in and whatever happened after that wasn't what he considered breaking in anymore. We took a side route onto the maintenance road that curved uphill behind the guest areas. The pavement changed there. Less polished, more patched, with weeds pushing along the edges and gravel spread thin where runoff kept cutting shallow channels through it. The floodlights got sparser the farther we climbed. Down below, I could still see some of the lower section through the trees and support fencing, but up there, the park changed shape. It stopped looking like a place for families and started looking like a property somebody was trying to keep from slipping fully into the mountain. Luther pointed out the breaker cabinet for the upper section, the fenced utility area, and the service corridor that ran behind the closed attractions on the uphill side. Most of that stretch was dead. No guest access, no active rides, no reason for anybody to be there unless they worked on the grounds or didn't belong there at all. A couple of old fixtures still had power, including a panel light near one attraction farther up the slope, and a pair of dim security lamps that left more dark between them than light under them. Ride 9 sat beyond a bend in the service corridor, mostly hidden from below by retaining wall, brush, and the backside of the structure around it. I didn't get a full look at it on that first pass, just the sense of a sealed attraction in the upper dark section, something enclosed and shut off harder than the rest. Luther didn't slow down enough to invite questions. We looped back down by another set of closed booths and a maintenance shed, with old work orders taped inside a dirty window. One of the names on the clipped sheet was Ricky Dalton, written in blocky pen strokes beside a date from a few weeks earlier. Luther noticed me looking and said, "Ricky handled overflow maintenance sometimes, mostly lights and panel faults when Ronnie wanted another pair of hands." The way he said it made it sound like Ricky came and went, but the place itself stayed the same. Somewhere near the lower service gate, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I stepped aside long enough to check it and saw another missed call from the lender, plus a voicemail notification I didn't need to listen to in order to know the tone. I put the phone away and kept walking, but my head was already doing the numbers for me. 2 nights here covered 1 payment, maybe enough left over for gas and groceries if nothing else hit first. A week or 2 more and I might buy time on the truck, not fix anything, just buy time. That was where my life had landed, paying for extra days. A minute later, Luther glanced at me once. "You need this job bad?" "Bad enough," I said. He didn't answer after that. He just kept walking the route, showing me which doors still mattered, which panels Ronnie wanted checked, which locks needed a harder pull to be sure they caught. The office radio worked. The lower path floodlights worked mostly. Front gate locks worked if you didn't rush them. Breaker access still worked. Most of the rest didn't. Most attractions were dead. Most guest areas were there for shape, not function. The upper side was where the place stopped pretending. By the time we circled back toward the office, I knew the rhythm of the job well enough to understand why it had sounded so simple in the posting. Walk the grounds, check the locks, mark the issues, stay awake. It was the kind of work a tired man could tell himself wasn't strange, as long as he kept moving and didn't think too hard about what exactly had been kept alive up there and what had only been left standing. We were almost back to the office when Luther stopped beside a rusted service cabinet near the wall, reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper I hadn't seen before. The paper had been folded so many times the creases looked soft. He held it a second without saying anything, and that was the moment I felt the job tip under my feet. Not because I knew what was on it, because I understood, all at once, that the strange part of the night hadn't started yet. Back in the office, the place felt smaller than it had 20 minutes earlier. The heater under the window clicked and rattled without putting out much warmth, and the smell of stale coffee had gone bitter in the air. Ronnie was behind the desk again, flipping through paperwork with the same flat concentration he'd had when I came in, like there was nothing on this property strange enough to break the habit of a man who'd already seen too much of it. The wall of monitors glowed over one shoulder. Most of them showed wet paths, dead corners, empty gates, and dim spill from the working floodlights. One was still full of steady static. Another was still turned face down against the wall. Luther set the flashlight on the counter, unfolded the paper, and held it out. "You keep this on you." I looked at the paper. "What is this?" "The part Ronnie doesn't put on the posting," he said. The sheet had been copied so many times the type looked soft around the edges. It had started life as a normal piece of office paper, but it had the limp feel of something that had ridden in too many jacket pockets and been unfolded by too many hands in bad light. The corners were rounded off. The creases had gone pale and fuzzy. There were pen marks in the margins, and one line scratched harder than the others in red ink, the letters pressed deep enough to show through the back. I gave a short laugh. "You serious?" Ronnie didn't look up from the desk. "He is." That landed harder than anything else in the room. I looked down again and started reading. The first line was ridiculous enough that I thought I had to be missing context. "If you hear the Carousel music after midnight, stop where you are and count to 60 before you move again. Do not walk toward it, even if it sounds close." I read it once, then again, because sometimes a sentence gets less stupid the second time. That one didn't. The next rule was worse in a way that made it harder to brush off. If you pass the prize booths in Midway Row and see one with its lights on, do not look inside. Mark the time, keep walking, and report it only after you are back in the security office. The language wasn't theatrical. That was part of what bothered me. It read like maintenance procedure, like a lockout sheet, like something written by men who didn't have time for style because they needed the wording to hold still long enough to keep somebody breathing. I moved to the third one. If a voice on the park speakers calls you by name, do not answer and do not turn toward the nearest speaker. Leave that path immediately and take the maintenance road downhill. I almost laughed again, but this time it died before it got out. There was a difference between hearing something creepy and reading a direct instruction about it in the kind of tone people use when they're explaining where the breaker keys go. Then I hit Rule 4, and that was where the whole page changed shape in my hands. Never unlock Ride 9 after dark, even if the panel shows a fault and even if someone is knocking from inside. Ride 9 was emptied years ago. Underneath that, written in red by hand, hard enough to scar the paper, was a second line. Do not open for knocking. I looked up from the sheet. Even if somebody's in there, neither of them answered right away. Ronnie kept moving papers into one stack and then another, though he hadn't looked at the page once. Luther just stood there with both hands on the counter, not tense, not dramatic, just patient in a way that felt worse than fear. The silence between them did more work than any story would have. That was the first moment I stopped treating the page like a joke. I looked down again and read the last rule. If you reach the front gate and see guests inside the park after 3:15 a.m., go back to the office, lock the door, and wait for the 3:33 announcement. Do not try to clear the grounds. They are not lost and they are not leaving with you. That one sat with me in a different way. The others were strange enough to invite disbelief. That one went past strange and landed somewhere colder. It assumed too much, Not only that I might see people in the park after hours, but that I might do the obvious thing and try to get them out, and that doing the obvious thing would be wrong. I let the paper lower a little and looked at Luther. He wasn't trying to sell me on it. That mattered. If he'd leaned in and started talking about local stories or unexplained incidents or the old dark history of the place, I would have checked out right there. But he didn't. He treated the page like a tool, same as the flashlight, same as the radio. Something you carried because there were nights when not carrying it cost more than your pride. He told me not every shift touched those rules. Most didn't. Some nights the ground stayed quiet, the locks stayed shut, and the whole place felt like what it looked like from the road, an old mountain property hanging on by habit. But if I needed the sheet, I wouldn't have time to sit down and reason my way through it. I'd need to remember it fast and do exactly what it said. That made more sense than it should have. The office had gone very still. I could hear the soft hum of the monitors, the occasional tick from the heater, rainwater dripping somewhere outside the back wall. I looked at the sheet again and saw more signs it had a history. A check mark beside Rule 2 in blue ink. A tiny circle around after midnight on Rule 1. A thumb smear of dirt or grease near the line about the maintenance road. This wasn't something printed for me tonight. It had been passed along, used, kept. I folded it once along the old crease and noticed there was a name half visible on the back where some other paper had once bled through. I couldn't make out much. Just the last name Bell typed faintly in a different font and the ghost of a date above it. It looked like it belonged to an old report or work order that had been reused under the copier at some point. I almost asked about it, but something in the room told me I wouldn't get much if I did. Ronnie finally looked up, not at me exactly, but at the folded page in my hand, like that mattered more than my face. He didn't warn me. He didn't reassure me. He just went back to his paperwork with the calm of a man who had already decided how much of the truth was useful. That was what made the rules feel real. Not the wording, not the red ink, not even Ride 9. It was the fact that neither man in that room acted like the page needed defending. I told myself there were better explanations than what the paper implied. Old-timer scare tactics, shift superstitions, a mean little tradition for new hires on a property with too much dead time and not enough oversight. Maybe the whole thing was just a test to see if I'd laugh and quit before they wasted another week on me. I wanted that explanation. I kept trying to fit the page into it, but the line in red stayed under my skin. Do not open for knocking. I folded the sheet smaller, slid it into my jacket pocket, and felt the weight of it settle there against the radio. It was just a piece of paper, soft from use, warmed a little by my hand. Nothing about it should have mattered. Still, when I headed back toward the door, I checked to make sure it hadn't slipped out. I remember thinking the rules were ridiculous. I remember thinking I'd carry them anyway. And I remember understanding, before I even stepped back into the cold, that the strangest part of the night had only just started. The first time I walked the route alone, I kept touching the folded rule sheet through my jacket like I was checking for cigarettes I already knew were there. The paper sat in the same pocket as the notebook Ronnie had given me, and every few steps I could feel both edges against my knuckles when my hand brushed my side. It was a stupid thing to be aware of. I knew that. But the whole property felt different once nobody else was talking. Some places only seem abandoned when you see them from a distance. Up close, they still have life in them. This place was the opposite. It looked half operational from the parking lot and from the office windows, but once I got out on the paths by myself, it felt hollow in a way that was hard to explain. Not dead exactly, more like staged after closing, with the people cleared out and the set left standing. Midway Row was the worst for that. The old booths, the rails, the shuttered windows, the empty prize racks behind scratched plastic, all of it looked like it had been arranged to suggest activity without ever reaching it. The floodlights that still worked didn't help much. They only made the dark in between feel more deliberate. Every lit patch ended too soon. Every shadow had hard edges. Water still clung to the concrete from the earlier rain, and the smell down there was wet leaves, old fryer grease caught somewhere in the walls, and something electrical that came and went depending on where I stood. My flashlight beam dragged across faded mascot faces, half-peeled signs for games nobody was ever going to play again, and little piles of leaves trapped in the corners of queue rails where feet used to pack them down before they could gather. I checked the first side lock, then the gate beside the lower snack stand, then the panel on the maintenance shed just off the path. All normal. Or normal enough. My radio stayed quiet except for a burst of weak static once when I turned too fast near one of the poles. I wrote down one dead bulb near the rear walkway and kept moving. Midway row bent slightly to the left near the old game stalls, and that was where I saw it. One of the prize booths was lit from inside, not bright, not clean. Just a weak yellowish light with the sad look of an old bulb burning through dust. The booth sat in the middle of 3 dead ones, its little counter window shut behind warped plastic and scratched glass, the inside shelves mostly lost behind reflections. If the light had been in a ride building or a maintenance room, I might have treated it like a wiring issue and gone closer. But in a booth like that, with everything around it dark and rotting in place, the light hit wrong immediately. It made the rest of the midway look staged around it. I stopped in front of the lit booth and said it under my breath. No. My own voice sounded too small out there. It got swallowed by the damp air in the buildings almost as soon as it left my mouth. I remembered Rule 2 before I even fully meant to. If you pass the prize booths in Midway Row and see one with its lights on, do not look inside. Mark the time, keep walking, and report it only after you are back in the security office. I stood there another second anyway, not staring into it, not exactly. Just seeing the light through the scratched window, catching little shapes that might have been stuffed animals on the back wall or sagging shelf hooks or nothing useful at all. Then I heard a tiny metallic sound from inside. Not loud enough to be dramatic. Just a small, neat sound, like a bell tapped once, or a coin chute catching, or something light falling off a shelf and landing against plastic. That was enough for me. I looked down at my watch instead of the booth, wrote the time in the notebook with a hand that felt colder than it should have, and kept walking. I told myself the wiring was bad. I told myself one of the old circuits could still be tied into a timer somewhere. I told myself the sound inside had probably come from expansion and settling, cheap materials holding water, old things shifting in old buildings. I had worked enough maintenance jobs to know that shut-down properties still made noise. Pipes clicked, metal popped, loose hardware rattled. There was a whole category of sounds that meant nothing. Still, I kept my eyes off the inside of that booth until it was behind me. The farther I got from it, the more embarrassed I felt, not scared exactly. Embarrassed. Like I'd just followed a prank instruction on instinct and let myself be played by a light bulb in a bad atmosphere. By the time I reached the lower bend near the Carousel fence, I'd almost convinced myself that was all it had been. Then I heard the music. It came from downhill and off to my left, thin and warped by distance, but unmistakable once my brain caught up to it. Carousel music. The kind of tinkling, looping melody that sounds cheerful in daylight and sickly the second you hear it where it shouldn't be. It wasn't loud. If anything, that made it worse. The sound just drifted there, through the trees and across the dark lower section like something too old to fully break. I stopped because the rule told me to stop. That was the part I hated most. I didn't stop because I believed it. I stopped because I'd already half let the sheet get under my skin, and once you've done that, not following the next instruction starts to feel like a dare. So I stood there on the path with one hand wrapped around the flashlight and counted in my head like an idiot. 1, 2, 3. By 10, I was cold and irritated. By 20, I was trying to decide whether the music had gotten louder or whether I was just listening harder. By 32, I could hear the blood moving in my ears. By 45, I was angry at myself for doing exactly what some folded piece of paper had told me to do. By 60, the music seemed farther away than before, which should have made me feel better. It didn't. When I started walking again, the path felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, nothing cinematic. It was more subtle than that, which is what bothered me. The stretch back toward the office seemed a little longer than it had on the way out. The pools of light from the working fixtures looked farther apart. My footsteps sounded flatter, with less echo off the rails and booth fronts. I remember thinking the whole midway had gone quieter, like the property had pulled something inward while I stood still counting. Even the air felt different. Colder, maybe, but also emptier in a way I couldn't put a real word to. I kept walking, checked the next latch, looked at the next service door, made my notes. Everything I did after that felt slightly delayed, like my body was keeping up with the job, but my attention was still back there near the carousel fence, listening to music that had no business playing on a dead property after midnight. By the time I got back to the office, my jacket had picked up a damp chill, and my fingers were stiff around the notebook. Ronnie was at the desk again with the same coffee cup and the same stack of paperwork, like the last half hour had been nothing more than a line item on another shift. Back in the office, I held up my notebook. Booth light on at 12:41. Ronnie took the note and asked, "You look inside?" "Not past the window," I said. Ronnie nodded once. "Good." I looked at him. "Good?" He didn't answer right away. He just set the notebook down beside the clipboard and reached for his coffee, like the question itself wasn't useful. That did more to raise the hair on my arms than the light or the music had. If he'd laughed, I could have laughed with him. If he'd told me old wiring did that sometimes, I could have worked with that. But he didn't. He reacted like I'd done the right thing in a way that had already been tested before I ever got there. That was the moment I should have walked out. I should have handed him the radio, dropped the keys on the desk, and driven my rattling truck back down the mountain before the night found a second way to make itself known. But I could still feel the missed calls sitting in my pocket, still see the payment amount in my head, still picture how little gas I had left and how much less time. Fear is one thing. Debt is another. Debt keeps a man standing in places his instincts are already begging him to leave. So I took the notebook back, kept the folded rules in my jacket, and told myself I could make it through one shift as long as I stayed moving and didn't let my nerves get ahead of me. I spent the rest of that first night trying to force the job back into a shape I could live with. That's what people do when something feels wrong before it feels impossible. You sort it into smaller parts. A lit booth, bad wiring, carousel music, old speakers catching current from somewhere they shouldn't. A tired manager who'd stopped explaining things because it was easier to let new hires decide what they could tolerate on their own. I kept moving, kept checking locks, kept writing things down in the notebook Ronnie had handed me, like all of it still belonged in the same world as a sticky latch or a dead floodlight. For a while, that almost worked. The lower section stayed empty. The midway looked dead in the same staged, hollow way it had before. I made another pass by the front gate and checked the chain housing again, even though I already knew it was fine. I tested the side service door by the shuttered snack stand. I looked in on the breaker shed and wrote down a humming panel that sounded rougher than it should have. Nothing jumped at me. Nothing moved. If I ignored the memory of the light in the booth and the music drifting through the lower section, I could still pretend the whole place was just old, underfunded, and full of men with bad habits. It was close to the end of the shift when the speakers clicked on. The sound came from somewhere farther up the grounds and to my right, not loud enough to blast across the property, but sharp enough to cut the quiet in one clean motion. I stopped without meaning to. It was just the click at first, the tiny live current sound of an old system waking up. Then came a wash of static, thin and dry, like a throat clearing before words. I couldn't make out a full sentence, not even close. What reached me sounded clipped, chewed up by age and distance, a fragment of a voice, a syllable. The shape of an announcement without any of the safety that should have come with a real one. It sounded close in the wrong way, like whoever was speaking thought I was nearer than I actually was. I was still trying to decide whether it had come from the lower midway or the upper side when Luther came around the bend from the maintenance road fast enough to answer the question for me. He didn't run. That would have felt dramatic. He just moved with the kind of quick, flat purpose that told me he had heard it too and didn't want me standing where I was any longer than necessary. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. He just angled me back toward the office with one look and a short motion of his flashlight. That was enough to prove the rules hadn't been some cruel shift joke. Whatever had spoken over those speakers, Luther had reacted to it before I'd even had time to settle on disbelief. Back inside, neither he nor Ronnie treated the moment like something worth putting in a report. That should have bothered me more than it did. By then, I was tired enough to accept the office as a kind of temporary shelter from questions I couldn't do anything with. I handed over the keys, signed out, and drove back down the mountain with the heater in my truck barely working and my thoughts trying to line up in a way they refused to do. The whole way home, I kept telling myself I hadn't actually heard words, just static and voice shape, just bad audio through old equipment, just a park with more half-working systems than it should have had. I slept badly, woke up sore, and spent most of the next day trying not to think about going back. Then my phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail the first time, the second time too. The third time I listened. The message was from the lender, and the voice on it had that professional calm some people use when they know fear is doing most of their work for them, the amount due, the date. The reminder that late turned into default faster than people like to believe. No threats, no shouting, just the pressure of a deadline spoken in a tone that made it sound inevitable. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my hand and did the math again. One more night helped. 2 more nights bought time. Walking away did nothing except leave me scared and broke in the same body at the same time. So I went back. The second drive up felt steeper, though I knew that was my nerves talking. The road was dry in places and slick in others, and every turn seemed to come sooner than I wanted it to. By the time the old sign and the front office lights came into view, my shoulders were already tight. Nothing about the property looked different from the night before. That almost made it worse. The same buzzing lot lights, the same dead stretches between them, the same tired glow from the office windows. Ronnie looked up when I stepped inside, took one glance at me, and didn't say anything that sounded like surprise. He had the clipboard ready before I even reached the desk. It hit me then that coming back was part of the whole thing. Not officially, not in any written policy, but in his mind, or maybe in the mind of the place itself. Night 1 didn't mean much by itself. Coming back for night 2 was the part that counted. Luther was already there, standing off to the side with his jacket on and the same flashlight clipped at his hip. He didn't ask how I'd slept. He didn't ask if I'd thought better of the job. He asked one thing, whether I still had the rule sheet. I told him I did, and that was enough for him. That told me more than I wanted to know. The early part of the second shift stayed almost insultingly normal. Locks, notes, panels, floodlights, the same damp concrete and old tourism rot, the same gray prizes in the dead booths, the same cold smell trapped in the wood and metal along Midway Row. If I'd been a different kind of man, I might have found that comforting. Instead, it felt like the property was waiting for me to settle into a false sense of routine before showing me what had changed. Ronnie mentioned Ricky Dalton might swing by if one of the upper panels acted up, but I never saw him. It happened farther down the midway than the first booth. I saw the light before I reached the bend, just a weak glow cutting across the path through warped plastic. Different stall this time, same yellow cast, same wrongness. It sat a few units down from the booth I'd logged the night before, close enough to feel deliberate but not close enough to dismiss as the same wiring issue repeating. I didn't stop in front of it the way I had before. I slowed, felt my pulse pick up, and kept my eyes on the path just long enough to confirm what I was looking at without staring inside. Something clicked softly from the booth as I passed, not loud enough to be useful, just another tiny, neat sound, like a game trying to wake up one piece at a time. I marked the time without breaking stride. The carousel music came sooner on night 2. It drifted in from downhill again, but not as faintly as the first time. I heard it plain enough to know the melody before I'd even fully processed where it was coming from. Thin, metallic, cheerful in a dead sort of way. It raised the hair on the back of my neck before I'd taken a full second breath. I stopped and started counting. I hated doing it, but not enough to disobey it. 10, 15, 20. The music stayed there, close enough now to feel like it had moved, though that might have just been me measuring distance differently because I knew what was coming. The midway seemed emptier while I stood still. Not darker. Emptier. Like the silence had gained shape around the music. 31. 32. 33. Then the speakers clicked. Not far. Not hidden. Somewhere ahead and uphill enough that I could feel the sound touch the side of my face before the words came through. This time, there was no static blur, no clipped half-announcement. The old system woke up and used my full name like it belonged to the property records. Owen Talley. Everything in me wanted to turn. That was the worst part of it, not the fear, the reflex. A human voice says your name and your body starts obeying before your mind can vote on it. I felt that pull in my shoulders, in my neck, in the stupid built-in instinct to orient toward recognition. For 1 second, the whole world narrowed down to the direction of the sound and whether I was going to be dumb enough to give it my face. I didn't answer. I didn't turn. I broke off the count and cut for the maintenance road downhill, so fast my boots slipped on wet grit at the edge of the path. I caught myself against the fence, kept moving, and didn't look toward the nearest speaker no matter how badly my body wanted that sense of control. The downhill service route felt longer than it had the night before. Fence on one side, brush and retaining wall on the other, pools of weak light breaking up the dark every 20 or 30 yards. My breath sounded too loud. The radio on my shoulder crackled once and then went dead again. Somewhere off beyond the fence line, I heard movement keeping pace with me, not crashing through brush, not running, just a steady presence matching my speed on the other side of the barrier, a brush of leaves, a footfall on damp ground. Then nothing. Then the sense of it again a few yards later, like whatever it was either knew the path or didn't need one. I kept moving downhill without looking. By the time I hit the lower bend near the office side access, my heartbeat had gone past fear and into that hard, cold rhythm your body uses when it has already decided something is real, whether you want it to be or not. I went through the side door too fast, shoved it closed harder than I meant to, and stood there a second, with one hand still on the push bar while the office heat hit my face. Luther looked at my face and said, "It used your name." "It did," I said. Ronnie set his coffee down. "Did you answer?" "No. Did you turn?" "Not once," I told him. Ronnie nodded once. "Then you're still you." That sentence sat in the room for a second after he said it. Nobody tried to soften it. Nobody laughed it off. Luther didn't look relieved exactly. Just unsurprised in the way men get when the bad thing they were worried about arrives on schedule. I took the radio off and set it on the desk harder than I should have. My hands didn't feel steady. I could still hear the shape of my name in the speaker voice, the way the old system had said it without hurry, like it had found an entry on a list and was calling the next one up. Ronnie asked for the time on the lit booth. I gave it to him. Luther asked if the music came first. I said it had. They both filed those answers away the same way they might have filed weather conditions or a gate fault. That was what changed me more than the speaker did. Up to that point, I'd still been trying to work my way toward a normal explanation. A twisted one, maybe, but normal. Old grounds, weird maintenance issues, bad procedures left in place too long, men passing down ugly habits because nobody above them cared enough to replace them with better ones. But once the speaker used my full name, and once Ronnie answered it with, "Then you're still you," I lost the right to pretend I was just auditing a troubled property. The thing out there had recognized me, not a worker in a jacket, not a shape on a path. Me. And the men in that office had been waiting to find out whether I would recognize it back. I should have walked then, I knew that. But the truck, the lender, and the amount due were all still waiting where I'd left them. Whatever this place was, it was still paying cash on Friday if I made it there. Fear doesn't erase numbers. It just changes the kind of price a man thinks he's paying. So I stayed. And sometime after 2, when the upper side had gone quiet enough that even the office heater sounded loud, I heard the first real knocking from inside Ride 9. The first knocking I heard from inside Ride 9 was soft enough that I almost mistook it for runoff hitting metal somewhere in the service corridor. Just a dull tap under everything else. Then it came again, cleaner this time, 3 knocks with even spacing between them, each one carrying through the wall and the door with the kind of steadiness that made it worse than panic would have. Panic is messy. Panic still belongs to living people. This sounded patient. Luther was already on his feet before I fully turned toward the sound. Ronnie didn't move from behind the desk right away, but the way he lifted his head told me he had heard it too. Nobody asked what it was. That was the point where the last piece of denial fell apart for me. If there had still been room for old wiring, settling metal, wind pressure, any of the lies I'd been trying to live inside, that sound killed them. Luther grabbed his flashlight, jerked his head once toward the hall, and I followed him back out into the cold. The air had changed since I'd come off the grounds a few minutes earlier. The temperature had dropped just enough to sharpen every breath, and the damp smell of the place had gone flatter, more metallic. The walk uphill felt longer now, maybe because I knew exactly where we were headed. The service road was mostly dark beyond the scattered lamps that still worked. Gravel popped under our boots, then went soft again where wet leaves had gathered along the edge. Somewhere down the slope I could hear the lower floodlights buzzing. Somewhere farther off, the old property settled into itself with little clicks and creaks like an animal making room in its bones. The knocking came again before we reached the bend. 3 hits. Pause. 3 more. By the time Ride 9 came into view, the red fault light on the panel was blinking harder than it had in the hook moment I'd remember later. Faster. Brighter. Not enough to throw real light, but enough to keep painting the nearby wall in a red pulse that looked almost wet on the metal. The service corridor around the attraction was narrow and boxed in by a retaining wall on one side and the sealed ride structure on the other. The place held sound badly. Every knock bounced off concrete and steel and came back changed. The panel beside the door was lit with a weak display that hadn't been live the first time I passed it. Now it cycled through short fault messages that flashed and disappeared before I could settle on them. Access error, then fault reset, then service request, then blank, then the same pattern again. The little status light below the screen stayed solid amber between red pulses, as if the whole system were waiting on somebody to decide whether what stood on the other side of that door counted as maintenance or emergency. The knocking changed when we got closer. It stopped doing the measured 3 and pause pattern and went slower, more spread out, like whoever was inside had heard us coming and was adjusting. That change bothered me more than the sound itself. There's something inhuman about anything that seems to recognize your distance through a wall. "That's not funny," I said. Luther caught my sleeve. "Keep walking." "There's somebody in there." He didn't let go. "No, there isn't." That should have been enough. It should have settled it. Luther had heard more of this place than I had, and he said it with the dead certainty of a man refusing an argument he had already had too many times. But my body didn't believe him, because bodies are built stupid around certain sounds. Knocking from behind a sealed door, a service panel lit up like an active fault, a voice where a voice shouldn't be. There are some combinations the nerves answer before the brain has time to help. We had almost drawn even with the door when something hit it once from the inside, harder than before. Not a slam. More like the flat impact of a palm or shoulder, enough to jolt the metal and send a low vibration through the handle housing. I felt the shock of it in my own chest. Then a voice came through the door. "Owen, come on, man." For 1 second, I didn't process the words. I processed the tone. Human, male, close, the kind of voice somebody uses when they know the person outside them and expect to be let out. Familiarity hit before identity did. My body locked up so completely it almost hurt. I looked at Luther. "Did you hear that?" "I heard it," he said. The voice had not sounded exactly like Trevor Sykes, not yet, but it had leaned hard enough in that direction to wake every bad memory in me at once. Same age range, same casual strain in the voice, same way of turning a sentence into a small assumption that you were already on his side. Trevor had made a whole life out of sounding reasonable 1 second before he cost somebody money the next. That sounded like Trevor. Luther kept his eyes off the door. I know what it sounded like. That chilled me worse than the voice. He knew because this wasn't random. Whatever lived in the rules or behind them, it wasn't throwing out noise and hoping something landed. It was selecting, testing, trying shapes until it found the one your body would reach toward before your mind could stop it. I could feel my pulse in my throat and in the cut of my palms where the keys bit into my hand. Every dumb instinct I had was telling me if a man I knew was behind that door, even a man I hated, then there was still a version of this where opening it made sense. Luther's grip tightened once, just enough to pull me back into motion. We kept walking. That was the part that felt wrongest. Not running, not shouting. Just walking past a sealed attraction with a live fault panel and a human voice behind the door, because a folded piece of paper and a tired man in a work jacket had both already told me that doing the human thing would get me killed or taken or changed into something they didn't want to name. I kept moving because Luther kept moving. I kept breathing because the alternative was to stop and let the whole scene settle around me until the choice looked reasonable. The corridor bent around the backside of the upper attractions and fed into a stretch of fence where you could see, through gaps in brush and old support rails, part of the lower grounds in the front approach. From up there, the park looked more wrong than abandoned. Not lively, not active, just arranged. Pools of light, dark lanes between them, turnstile shadows, empty queue channels zigzagging through the lower section, except they didn't look completely empty anymore. At first, I thought it was depth playing tricks on me. The kind of visual drift you get when you stare downhill through fencing and branches at mixed light. Then one of the shapes near the front gate shifted. Not much, just enough to separate itself from the rails around it. Another stood farther back in one of the queue lanes and stayed so still I only knew it was there because it blocked a strip of reflected light on wet pavement. A third shape appeared near the outer fence, where nobody should have been standing at that hour, upright and waiting in a way that didn't match trespassers, drunks, teenagers, or any other category my brain wanted to file it under. The radio on my shoulder crackled. Ronnie's voice came through, thinner than usual behind static, asking for Ricky Dalton. Not me, not Luther. Ricky. No answer came back. Ronnie called again, same name, same short tone. Still nothing. I'd only heard Ricky's name in passing before that. A maintenance hand. A sometime extra set of hands when the property wanted one. But in that moment the failure of the radio mattered more than the man. Another person tied to the grounds, and when Ronnie reached for him, the silence that came back felt active rather than empty. Not just no response. A missing piece where a response should have lived. Luther didn't comment on it. That told me enough. We moved along the fence line and checked 2 more access points because that was what the job still required, and because I was beginning to understand that the routine wasn't just habit. It was structure. The normal motions were the only thing keeping the night from getting ahead of us faster. But every part of the route felt thinner now, like the old shape of the shift was wearing through. The upper service lights hummed louder. The dark between them seemed deeper. Once, halfway back down toward the office cut-through, I looked across the lower queue lanes again and saw what looked like 2 figures standing side by side with the wrong amount of space between them, both facing the same direction, both too still to be real people deciding what to do next. That was when I understood that the rules had not been invented to scare new hires into obedience. Somebody had learned them the hard way, not in one big dramatic night either. That would have been easier to dismiss. No, these rules had the feel of accumulated cost, men hearing the music and walking toward it, men stopping at a lit booth and looking inside, men turning when their names came over the speakers, because people always turn when they hear their own names. Somebody, maybe more than one somebody, opening a sealed door because something on the other side sounded human enough to make not opening it feel cruel. Every line on that folded sheet suddenly read like the last surviving note from a mistake that had already happened at least once. We made it back toward the office side in a silence that was less about calm than about not wanting to say the wrong thing out loud. Ronnie's voice came over the radio once more, shorter now, telling us he had eyes on movement by the gate. Luther acknowledged with a click and nothing more. At the lower bend, I looked through the fence one last time and saw that the shapes near the front had multiplied. Not a crowd. Not yet. But enough that I couldn't explain them away as angles or shadows anymore. They stood inside the approach lanes and near the turnstiles with that same terrible stillness, not wandering, not testing fences, not acting like lost people who needed help. Just there, present, waiting in lines that no longer had any business existing. By then my fear had moved past surprise. Surprise belongs to the first thing, the first lit booth, the first music, the first voice over the speakers. This was something heavier, a pressure that settled into the ribs because the world in front of me no longer needed my belief to keep happening. It was happening anyway, and by the time I saw movement gathering near the front gate, I knew one thing as clearly as I've ever known anything. The rules were never meant to scare new hires. They were meant to keep people alive. We should have gone straight back to the office after that pass by the fence, but Ronnie still had eyes on the gate side, and Luther wanted the upper route checked one more time before the night moved any deeper. So we turned back uphill under the weak service lights, and I walked straight into the part of the night that knew exactly where to press. The corridor behind Ride 9 felt tighter the second time. Same retaining wall, same sealed door, same bad little pocket of cold held between concrete and metal. But now the fault light on the panel was pulsing in a faster rhythm, and the display was cycling through its messages without ever settling long enough to feel like a real system problem. Access error, fault reset, service request, blank, then back again. The knocking had stopped. That silence made me slow down more than the knocking had. I didn't realize I was doing it until Luther shifted half a step in front of me, like he already knew the exact point in the corridor where people started making mistakes. He kept his flashlight low, beam angled off the ground instead of straight at the door. I did the same without thinking. Maybe because I didn't want to see the handle. Maybe because some part of me had already started understanding that looking directly at the wrong thing too long was its own kind of answer. Then the voice came again, softer than before. Not through a speaker, not carried across distance, right there at the seam of the sealed ride door, as if somebody stood with his mouth close to the crack. "Owen, I got your money." My body reacted before my thoughts did. It was like being hit behind the breastbone with something cold and flat. Trevor had used that exact tone 100 times when he wanted something from me or wanted me to calm down long enough to keep listening. Not loud, not aggressive, just easy, familiar. The voice of a man who'd never had to live inside the consequences of his own promises, because he was always already halfway out the door when he made them. Luther saw my face and said, "Don't." I hated how quickly the hate came after that. Not for Luther, for Trevor, for myself, for the whole chain of rotten choices that had led me to a dead mountain park after 2 a.m, listening to a sealed attraction use the voice of the man who'd gutted my life and walked off smiling. Trevor wasn't just a scammer to me. He was proof that I had let desperation turn me stupid. Every missed payment, every voicemail, every time the truck made that dry rattle climbing a hill, and I wondered whether I'd lose the only thing I had left that still moved me from one day to the next. Trevor sat inside all of it. "He took everything I had," I told him. Luther kept his eyes on the panel. That's why it picked that voice. That should have steadied me. It should have reminded me the thing behind the door was not Trevor, could not be Trevor, was only wearing the outline of him because it had found the shape that fit best under my ribs. But explanation doesn't erase temptation. Sometimes it sharpens it. Knowing you're being manipulated doesn't kill the weak point. It just makes you ashamed of still having one. I stood there in the pulse of the red fault light with the keys digging into my palm, and for one ugly second, I pictured exactly what the voice had offered. Trevor on the other side of the door with a duffel bag or a check or a stack of folded cash held together with rubber bands. Trevor shoved back into my life by something bigger and meaner than either of us, finally cornered into giving up what he'd taken. It was impossible, childish, not even close to rational. But debt has a way of rotting your imagination until impossible things stop feeling ridiculous and start feeling expensive to ignore. The voice came through the seam again. "You want your truck back or not?" That was the one that hit hardest, not because the truck was beautiful or worth much. It wasn't. It was old, rusting around the wheel wells, loud in bad weather, and one repair away from being more trouble than sense. But it was mine. It was also collateral. It was also the last thing in my life that still let me act like I had some control over where I went and what work I could say yes to. Lose the truck, and the lender didn't just take metal. He took options, range, pride. The thin lie a man tells himself that he can still get out of a hole if he keeps moving. My hand shifted on the key ring before I even knew I'd moved it. The service key for Ride 9 wasn't marked in any obvious way, but I had already learned the feel of the ring well enough to know which side held the heavier access keys and which side held the more ordinary locks. I didn't pull one free. I didn't reach for the door. But some traitor part of my body had already begun sorting possibility from panic. That was the ugliest feeling of the night, not fear, recognition, because part of me wanted to open it, not because I believed the ride contained salvation, not cleanly anyway. It was worse than that. Part of me wanted the chance to grab Trevor by the front of his shirt and demand that the world make sense for 5 seconds, to drag him out under the dead service lights and force him to look at what he'd done. To hear him explain how he could vanish that easy while I took the calls, watched the numbers climb, and kept pretending one more week might be enough to keep the rest of my life from being repossessed a piece at a time. Horror gets cleaner when it's just fear. This wasn't clean. This was hunger, dressed up like reason. The red panel light jumped over my knuckles. The corridor had gone quiet, except for the hum in the wall and the small sound of my own breathing. I could smell cold metal and damp concrete and a faint electrical heat from the panel itself, like the whole attraction was running some private fever behind the wall. The voice moved closer to the crack. "Open up!" My jaw locked hard enough to ache. I heard how unsteady I sounded. "Shut up!" The second the words left my mouth, Luther turned his head toward me. Not fast, not startled, worse than that, tired, because now I understood something before he ever said it. The rules hadn't only been about what you did with your hands. They were about what you gave back. Attention, recognition, participation, looking inside, turning toward the speaker, answering the voice. The thing behind the door had spoken in Trevor's voice, and I had given it something human in return. Not much, just 2 words. But it had gotten them. The fault light on the panel changed rhythm after that. It didn't speed up. It settled. The display blinked once, went blank, then came back with a cleaner, steadier line of text than before. Not a full sentence, just enough to feel deliberate. Access received. I felt the blood drain out of my face. Luther stepped in hard then, not theatrical, not angry, just immediate. He caught my elbow and turned me bodily away from the door before I could read the panel again or make the mistake of listening for another word through the seam. The movement broke whatever spell I'd let settle around me for those few seconds. My boots scuffed against wet grit. The keyring slapped against my thigh. Somewhere downhill, the radio clicked with a burst of static that sounded like someone keying up and thinking better of it. We put distance between ourselves and Ride 9 without running, but only because Luther was forcing the pace to stay just slow enough to count as controlled. I kept looking at the ground in front of me because I didn't trust my head not to turn back toward the door. My mouth tasted sour. My hand still hurt from squeezing the keys. Shame sat higher in my chest than fear did, and that was saying something. Trevor had taken my money, but this place had gone after something meaner. It had reached straight into the shape of the mistake I lived with every day and found the one offer I still wanted badly enough to hate myself for wanting. Not forgiveness, not revenge, repair, a rewind, one impossible second chance. By the time we hit the bend in the corridor and the sealed door was out of sight, I knew the night had changed. The park had stopped testing whether I would follow the rules and started learning what it could use to move me. And that was when Luther finally decided I was too far in to keep the truth from. By the time we got back into the office, I felt like I'd left part of myself standing in that corridor outside Ride 9. Not in some poetic sense, in a practical one. The version of me that could still tell himself this was just a bad property with bad people and bad habits had been stripped out somewhere between Trevor's voice at the door and the panel blinking access. Received back at me like it had just logged a successful transaction. Luther shut the side door behind us and slid the deadbolt across without being asked. Ronnie looked up from the desk as soon as he saw my face, and then looked past me at Luther, which told me whatever had just happened fit into a pattern he'd already learned not to waste words on. The room felt hotter than before, but only because my skin had gone cold. The old heater knocked under the window, the monitors hummed. Static ghosted across the one bad screen in a constant white shimmer that felt less like equipment failure and more like one more thing everybody there had stopped asking about. Luther sat forward and said, "The rules aren't there to keep you safe from the park." I looked at him. "Then what are they for?" "They keep the park from thinking you belonged to that last night." That was the first full truth anybody had given me since I drove up the mountain. And even then it wasn't the kind that cleaned anything up. It only shifted the shape of the dark. Luther didn't launch into some long story. He gave me what I needed because there wasn't enough night left for anything else. Years back, before the property was cut down to the half-dead version of itself I'd walked into, the place had tried to squeeze one more season out of rides and sections that should have been shut earlier than they were. A final run, a final push, the kind of decision people make when money gets thin and pride gets louder than maintenance logs. The bad night came during one of those closing stretches. Ride 9 faltered. Maybe once, maybe more than once. The cycle didn't finish clean. The unload didn't finish clean. Counting went wrong after that. Whether because people panicked, management lied, somebody overrode something they shouldn't have, or all of it at once, he didn't say. What mattered was simpler and worse. The park didn't close right. The final night never ended in the order it was supposed to. I stood there with my hands braced on the back of a chair and looked at the rule sheet still peeking from my jacket pocket, and all at once, every line on it stopped looking bizarre and started looking expensive. The carousel music wasn't just random noise. It was the sound of the lower route opening. Not for me. For the night the place still thought it was supposed to be running. That was why the rule said stop and count to 60. Not because standing still scared it off, but because movement mattered. Walk toward the music, and you weren't just investigating a sound. You were taking the path the guests took. Entering the route the place wanted filled. The lit booth on Midway Row wasn't just some dead bulb waking up in the wrong stall. It was a participation point, a place where a person became part of the transaction of the park. Look inside and you weren't just seeing something wrong, you were letting it see you back in the frame it understood. That was why the rule didn't say, don't go near it. It said, don't look inside. The speaker using my name was worse than either of those, because it meant the park had done more than wake up part of an old sequence. It had recognized a living person on the grounds and tried to place him. Names matter in systems, in logs, on clipboards, on shift rosters, on missing persons counts. A voice over the speaker saying Owen Talley was not some ghostly flourish. It was active recognition, the place reaching into the present and trying to decide whether I belonged in it. Ride 9 sat at the center of all of it like a bad hinge. An unfinished ride cycle, an unload that never finished, maybe an evacuation that never finished either, a closeout that never got signed off in any way that mattered. The sealed door wasn't holding in a monster. It was holding open a procedural wound the grounds kept trying to close around. That was why the rule was so specific. Not, don't go near it. Not, don't investigate. Never unlock it after dark, even if the panel shows a fault, even if someone is knocking. Because anything that made opening it feel compassionate, practical, or necessary was part of the same broken sequence trying to complete itself. And the guests, after 3:15 a.m., that was the one that finally made every hair on my arms stand up. They were not lost. They were not leaving with you. I understood it now. If the park had missing numbers, it filled them. If it had unfinished positions in the chain, it looked for bodies to drop into place. Ronnie's voice came over the radio. Gateside's filling up. I grabbed the handset. Filling up with what? Ronnie took a second before answering. Guests. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound dramatic. That made the word land harder. Guests, not people, not trespassers, not movement. Guests, a category, a function. The kind of term you use when you're trying to stay precise because precision is the only thing between you and panic. I crossed to the monitors and looked at the lower camera feeds. The gateside had changed. The queue lanes that should have been empty now held shapes in scattered lines, too still and too orderly to be anybody wandering around lost after hours. The front approach had more of them than before, a figure near the turnstiles, two under the weak spill of a lamp by the fence, another standing halfway down a lane with its body angled toward the path, as if waiting for someone to wave it through. None of them moved like people deciding what to do next. They occupied positions. That was when running stopped sounding like a real plan. If I bolted out the back door and made it to my truck, maybe I got downhill before anything else changed. Maybe I didn't. But if this place had already recognized my name and logged my voice and started trying to fit me into its broken night, Leaving the office wouldn't mean exiting clean. It would just mean doing it without understanding the rules anymore. I needed structure, same as before. Only now I knew why. "Who was Tommy Bell?" I asked. Luther didn't look at me when he answered. "One of the names that never left this place right." That line hit me harder than anything else he'd said, not because it explained Tommy Bell. It didn't. It left him hanging there in the dark with all the others implied around him. Operator, maintenance hand, guest, supervisor, I didn't know. Maybe Luther didn't either, or maybe the exact role didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Tommy Bell was one of the names still tied into the unfinished chain, one of the entries the place had never successfully cleared. That explained why the old work paper ghosted through the rule sheet had bothered me before I understood it. The whole property felt built on reused paperwork, inherited procedure, and jobs that should have been signed off long ago and never were. Luther told me the office and the old console were the only places on the grounds where the system still listened in a way a person could use. The speakers, the route timing, parts of the lower open-close logic, fragments of the scripted guest messaging, all of it still ran through patched control layers nobody had fully bothered or fully dared to rip out. The park was trying to complete a closing sequence it had broken years ago. If it could be made to hear one or something close enough to count, then maybe the chain broke the other way for long enough to let the people in the office survive the rest of the night. That was the part I hated, because I understood the price of it before either man said it out loud. To make the park hear a closing action, it had to hear someone perform one, not just push a button and duck. A real voice. Somebody reading the line in a way the old system would accept. And if I did that, the same logic that had just used my name over the speakers might decide I belonged to the closing roster after all. Not fully, but enough. I looked at the stained old console built into the side desk under the monitors. Half the labels were worn off. A strip of yellowed tape held a short typed line beside one switchbank. The microphone cradle was cracked. It looked less like the heart of a haunted property than the kind of equipment a county fair office might limp along with for 10 years past replacement. That made it worse. Real systems survive longer than people think they should, especially if nobody ever fully shuts them down. The lower gate feed flickered once. One of the shapes in line was suddenly closer to the turnstile than it should have been. Luther watched me watching the monitors and didn't try to sell me bravery. He just said the truth in the plainest terms possible. If I wanted out, I was going to have to let the grounds hear me. Otherwise, the sequence kept moving, and the office wasn't going to stay separate from it for much longer. I looked at the microphone, then at the static-heavy camera feed, then at the folded rules in my pocket. The thing that settled in me right then wasn't courage. It was a narrower, uglier understanding. Surviving this wasn't going to mean staying clean. It was going to mean choosing what kind of mark I was willing to let the place put on me. If I wanted to get off that mountain alive, I was going to have to make the system hear me. And once it did, I knew it might never stop hearing my name. A few minutes after 3:15 a.m., the ground stopped looking half dead and started looking open in the wrong way. The lower camera feeds showed it first. The figures near the front gate were no longer scattered in ones and twos. They were standing in loose lines inside the queue lanes and near the turnstiles, facing inward the way people do when they think something is about to start. None of them moved much. That was what made them so hard to look at. Real people shift their weight, glance around, scratch, fidget, check phones, lean on rails. These didn't. They just occupied space like the park had remembered where bodies were supposed to go and laid them back into place. Somewhere downhill, the Carousel music started up again, thin and bright and completely wrong. It lasted only a few seconds before cutting off, then came back in a warped little loop. On another monitor, a midway light flickered on where nothing should have had power at all. The whole property looked like pieces of an old night trying to come back on in the wrong order. Then, The fault light for Ride 9 came alive again on the upper feed, blinking hard enough to wash the wall beside the door in red. I stood over the old console with one hand on the edge of the desk and stared at the yellowed strip of typed instructions taped beside the switches. The tape had curled at one corner. The letters had faded unevenly. It looked cheap, ordinary, and tired. That made it feel more dangerous, not less. Nobody builds horror into a thing on purpose. What ruins you is the equipment that was always meant for routine. Ronnie's voice came over the radio. If you're going to do it now. I looked at the old console. What exactly am I doing? Luther kept his eyes on the dark glass. Closing the night. That was the truth of it. Not saving the grounds, not breaking a curse, not fighting anything. Just closing the night the way it had failed to close before and praying the system cared more about sequence than ownership. Outside the office windows, the dark had changed texture. The lower lot still looked empty from one angle, but if you let your eyes settle, you could see shapes at the edges of the floodlight spill, waiting at the boundary between visibility and dark. The turnstile lanes on the gate camera looked fuller every time I glanced back. One of the figures now stood right up against the metal bars, head tilted in a way no living person would hold for long. Another seemed to be pushing a stroller through nothing but shadow. The microphone felt greasy with old use when I lifted it from the cradle. My hand did not feel steady. I could hear my own breathing in the office and the dry hum of the monitor bank and a faint, irregular knocking through the wall that told me Ride 9 was still there, still waiting, still unfinished. I thought about Trevor's voice behind that door. I thought about the panel reading access received after I answered it. I thought about the simple fact that after tonight, whether I lived or not, this place was going to know me. I keyed the mic and said, "Attention guests." My voice came back through the office speakers a half-second later, thinner and flatter than it had sounded in my head. The words on the tape strip gave the rest of the script in broken lines, old closing language for the lower grounds, the midway, the front gate, and final movement to exits. I read it exactly as it was written. I did not improvise. I did not pause longer than I had to. The park had spent the whole night teaching me that exactness mattered here. As I read, the grounds answered. The carousel music cut off mid-phrase like somebody had pulled the plug on a memory. Two of the lower floodlights blinked out. On the gate feed, the figures in the queue lanes seemed to lose shape all at once, not vanishing cleanly, but breaking apart into patches of dark where bodies had been a second earlier. One of them was simply gone between frames. Another stood there until the lamp above it died, and then there was nothing left to see. Something hit the inside of Ride 9 so hard the office window shivered in its frame. I kept reading. The old script ended with a final line about the grounds being closed and all guests exiting through the main front approach. I said that too, and the moment the last word left my mouth, every active screen on the console flickered. The bad static-heavy monitor went black. The office lights dimmed, surged once, then dropped out completely. For 1 second, the only things left were the red blink from the upper panel feed and the emergency glow over the back door. Then, the red blink died too. The knocking stopped. The silence after that was so total it made my ears hurt. Nobody moved for a few seconds. Ronnie said something over the radio, but the system was dying under him, and all I got was a torn burst of static and the end of a word. Luther crossed to the window and stood there looking out into the dark lower grounds. I stayed where I was with the microphone still in my hand, because I understood in a cold, final way that the night had heard me. Not just my voice, me, Owen Talley. A living body on the property, speaking the closing words into an old system that had been waiting years to hear them from somebody. Morning came slow and gray. By first light, the grounds looked like a dead place again, Wet concrete, dark booths, empty lanes, no guests, no movement. Ride 9 sat uphill in the washed-out dawn like any other sealed attraction on a failing property. If I hadn't lived the night myself, I could have talked myself into almost anything by then. Ronnie counted out my pay in the office without ceremony and slid the envelope across the desk. He didn't thank me. He didn't explain anything else. He just told me not to come back, and I believed him. I gave him the keys and the flashlight. I kept the folded rules for 1 second too long before setting them down, too. Luther never tried to stop me. He looked like a man who had watched the same shape of ending happen in different forms before. I left the mountain just after sunrise and did not look back at the property once the road bent enough to hide it. I quit that morning, not formally, not with a phone call. I just never went back. For 3 days, I told myself that meant I was done with it. Then, 3 nights later, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the dead radio on my kitchen counter clicked on in the dark. Static filled the room. Then, the old park voice said, "Owen Talley, report uphill." I didn't go, but I still wake up a few seconds before 3:33 a.m., like some part of me is listening for my name before the speakers get the chance to say it.